The Certainty Principle by David Light. Chapter 12, Big Brain Organ. Sections 14 and 15. 12:14. Intuition. Intuition, according to Wikipedia, is having a nose for knowledge without proof, evidence, or conscious reasoning, or without understanding how the knowledge was acquired. It is a choice without thought. Identity blocks intuition in the same manner that processed foods block your digestion. To the extent that my wraps define my experience, I am insulated from real experience, and my capacity for making reality based choices intuitively is limited. Intuition is key to certainty. Learning to trust intuition leads to insights that are impossible through the cognitive milling of your brain alone. Certainty is achieved by learning to rely on intuition through the non rational, non binary, identity free skill of seeing things the way they really are. And this path can deliver extraordinary insights. Quote, "The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant. It is intuition that holds the power to save you." Unquote. Einstein. If brain function is like digestion, intuition is like breathing. Most thoughts are transient byproducts of an abstracting device called the brain in its persistent course of rationalizing sensory input. Let's call this braining for a short form for uh, the reference to that notion of milling on things and always trying to reason everything. If braining becomes my default state, I'm susceptible to the illusion that my brain's thought domain is the limitation of what is possible and understandable, or even the entire domain of fact. So this leads to this attitude of someone who knows it all, confidently feels that their scope of perception and reasoning is everything, is the whole story, which of course is not even close to the truth. But that's what happens when you get in your own head, right? And especially when the story in your head is the story about you and you're trying to perpetuate that story all the time. You lose your objectivity. After all, if I should become enthralled with an impossible task of labeling and judging in terms of how it defines me, every piece of data that enters my senses, how long before I come to believe that my braining is reality? Yeah, so when you're thinking all the time, trying to rationalize, reason, and justify biases, that braining becomes like the water a fish is swimming in. You don't see anything else but it. I recognize that identity is a complete fabrication. Once I recognize that identity is a complete fabrication, an illusion, I begin to see things as they are, and I begin to be able to evaluate things as they are. Remember, the brain is only efficient in its linear single port bidirectional processor. It is easily overpowered by my compulsion with me, my identity. Like many around the age of 16, about the same time I became preoccupied with girls, I was having a crisis of identity. My self image had degraded to the point that I was near suicidal, typical of a kid from a busted home, aimlessly reliant on the charity of my friends. Yeah, so identity crisis that happen in the teenage years is because you're raised thinking that identity is reality. And then what happens is when you get to be a teenager, the truth becomes apparent to your brain that identity is really an illusion, is not what the world is all about. Some people either have a destructive moment then where the identity shatters and they can see the world the way it is, or They choose to perpetuate that identity and ignore or avoid the conflict. Unless they're hit with some kind of pattern interrupting experience, like many kids do, like broken families, some kind of breakup, some kind of cataclysmic loss, some kind of semi traumatic event that shakes you out of that delusion. The process took a few years, but for a self consumed kid like me, the confusion around fitting in had finally become intolerable. One cool Sunday night in October, a friend's parents had dropped me off to catch the last train back to my hometown. I was too embarrassed to tell them that I didn't have the money to pay for the ticket. As the last train pulled out of the station, I realized I was really stuck. I had nothing but the clothes on my back, which included a sweater and a Navy issue wool pea coat, plus a small backpack with another sweater and a beat up empty wallet, holding a picture of my father and a 4-leaf clover he'd given me, plus a picture of my sister Dee. I put on the other sweater and sat down on the bench. I was stuck. I had no choice but to come to terms with being alone, cold, broke, hungry, and miles away from a warm bed. I bundled up and slid into the dark end of the station so I couldn't be seen. As usual, my brain began grinding away at how miserable I was, how much I wanted to eat and be warm, be with my friends. But this loop had been running in my brain for a few years, and I was becoming sick and tired of hearing it. I was bored with going over and over the same needy ground again and again. I was bored with myself. As I gazed up at the stars, it occurred to me that maybe my constant wanting, bitching really, was part of my problem. Maybe detaching from all that stuff that I constantly craved would provide me with some peace, letting go. Even then, it seemed illogical. All I needed, warmth, food, companionship, seemed perfectly natural. But the powerful intuition that wanting was making me suffer felt right and correct, even if the wanting seemed justified. Yeah, so even with the wanting seemed justified, the idea that I was preoccupied with it and it had become my needy identity seemed way wrong. It seemed like a broken premise. And this was causing me terrific conflict, like self destructive conflict. During the 20 or 30 minutes of sitting there in the cold, my eyes remained fixed to the night sky. I've been focusing so hard on one cluster of stars that I barely blinked. I was suddenly rattled back to reality by the uncanny sensation of being physically drawn away from where I was sitting. The strong sensation of letting go, like dropping rapidly in an elevator, but going up instead and away. Breaking my gaze, I regained my composure and reminded myself about my insight about wanting. But again, within minutes, the appeal of the letting go sensation drew my eyes back to the star. It was very weird at the time because I felt like almost like I was dying. That's the way it felt, like I was becoming separated from myself physically. I was scared but curious about this current running through my, it was very exciting. I was very like lit up. I didn't know if I was slipping into insanity or out of consciousness. After a few rounds, I realized that I was unwittingly prepared to surrender entirely, my entire life, to this uncanny gravity that was taking me away. It's hard to define this sensation, but it was very, very powerful. That's when the thought occurred to me, what if there's no coming back? So it occurred to me that what if what's really happening is I'm slipping out of sanity or something, slipping out of life, and that there's no return? Because there was a very strong sense that I was going away from everything, leaving behind. I reasoned I needed a safety switch, so I set a rule in my head that I would return to the bench if I reached the point that I no longer cared if I ever returned to the bench again. This is weird, yeah. The way it actually occurred to me is that I don't care if I never come back. I don't care if I never see these people again. Like I'm gone and I don't care. And I thought if I ever reached that point, I was going to pull myself back out of it. That's when the thought occurred to me, what if there's no coming back? I reasoned I needed the safety switch. This decision infused the experience with a new sense of confidence. I thought I could handle it. The first time I knew I'd overcome or at least completely neutralized my fear of controlling my thoughts. Yeah, I didn't care where my brain went. That control allowed me to free myself from caring about what was next. It's a very important point. Not caring about what was next. I was ready for anything, no matter what happened. Whatever awaited me was what awaited me. I was prepared for anything, good, bad, or whatever that followed. I'll go back when I don't care if I ever go back again. And I recall that pretty strongly. It was the affirmation I repeated over and over hundreds of times. I don't know where thought came from, but each time I repeated it, I could feel the tug of my brain holding me back. But each time I felt myself moving a little farther and farther away from the bench. My attachment to and desire for the familiar, all who I knew and cared for, became weaker and weaker. Part of me was afraid, but a larger part wanted to go. So I kept repeating, I'll go back when I don't care if I ever go back again. Until, in an instant, when the connection snapped and I was free. And this was a powerful instant. Everything changed at that moment. The way I seemed to perceive everything became different. And it's very difficult to put it into words, but how powerful this experience was. Next thing I knew, a train was pulling into the station. Turns out there was another train. Now very cold and hungry, I sprinted to get aboard. Whether they threw me off the next station or not, I didn't care. I was freezing. When I opened the door into the bright, toasty car, I realized something had changed. I'd come to associate riding trains, especially at night, as a sad, even lonely experience. Many weekends, I'd taken the train from one friend's house to another, one piece of work to another, feeling kind of lost. Not this time. As I entered the nearly empty train, there was no longer the familiar feeling of self-pity. In its place was this unfamiliar, disturbing sensation that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. To be as accurate as I can in words, nothing looked unfamiliar, but the feeling I had was radically unfamiliar. I could not have been the least bit surprised if the conductor had walked up to me and told me I was dead. Instead, he asked for my ticket. After explaining that I had no money, he asked where I was going, punched out a receipt, and told me not to let it happen again. My identity, which constantly filtered and colored every inch of experience, was gone. Clarity was all that remained, unadorned, unjustified clarity. On the ride home alone that night in the train car, I was awed and frightened by the imposing sense of reality that was accompanying every turn of my head. I knew the experience was mine, entirely individual, but it was so foreign that I was convinced I was losing it. In retrospect, I liken it to the anxiety that an inmate might feel when finally set free after a long confinement. Though I actually don't know what that experience is like. For some reason, that's what I thought it must be like, because I felt like I was coming out of someplace dark. Though I knew it was real, I was stronger for it. I was unprepared for the impact of seeing things as they really were. For months afterwards, I tried erasing all memory of the experience, writing off to teenage angst, even though I knew in my heart otherwise. I sought safe harbor in my identity and its familiar self-talk, to which I attribute many poor choices and missed opportunities. The familiar misery of vanity might have masked the certainty I'd achieved at 16, but it was always there, just below the surface, ever since that day. And not long after that, I threw on a backpack, a watch cap, and stuck out my thumb, and I was gone.